actually go through each one of them. So I'll just raise few common questions that these scholars have raised and have tried to sort of provide certain kind of analytical clarity. The problematic of linguistic nationalism considers the category of language a deeply political and ideological one, which gets aligned with several other categories of culture, religion, race, region, class, and caste. The relationship between language formation, along with socio-cultural and political formation of identities, is a complex and deeply divided one, both culturally and politically. The ideological and cultural basis of linguistic nationalism often invokes the ideals and objectives of democratic citizenship and secular but culturally embedded notion of identity formation. The notion of linguistic nationalism is a form of political nationalism, and that's something I think is important to bear in mind, that it's not just about language and nationalism, but it's also a form of political nationalism in the historiography of nationalism, remains under-theorized conceptually, normatively, and historically. And that has been the case for a very, very long time. Social scientists, including historians, political scientists, economists, and cultural sociologists, working in the field of languages and literary genres of various sorts, have used the category of language more as a descriptive marker of ethnicity and identity, and less as an epistemological category of social and cultural practices and relations embedded within a specific socio-historical and political context. To be more specific, there have been a number of writings, just I can more specifically talk about India, where writers like Paul Brass, a very well-known scholar of political science, Jyotindra Das Gupta, Robert King, Vasudha Dalmia, and Sumati Ramaswamy, among others, have actually highlighted this aspect. So linguistic nationalism as a category of analysis further helps us understand the political processes that go into the making of a national or a state languages as official languages. The aim seems to be about the production of a dominant linguistic community and to collectivize the social into a more exclusive linguistic ideology, which is predicated upon reconstructing the social and cultural hierarchies, whether through the distinction between private public, that is to say, contestation over the categories like mother tongue, dialect, regional, national languages, or through the idea of pure and impure or sacred and profane languages, majority and minority languages, and so on. It projects an ideology of linguistic rationalization as part of the state rationalization in the spheres of culture, social diversity, and mobility. Therefore, linguistic nationalism as a historical process has had capillary roots in an exclusive ideology of cultural nationalism. So that's where I want to situate the idea of linguistic nationalism, both as part of a state rationalization project, as well as a larger phenomena of cultural nationalism. The major writings on nationalism, and that's what I really want to talk about now, have accepted the relationship between language and nation as innate and naturally given. Those who have drawn attention to this relationship have done it as an identity marker. And let me just talk about very few scholars, since there is not much time in my hand. For example, the earlier writer on nationalism, Keduri, considers language as an important criteria for the unitary creation of a nation state, whereas Barth, Frederick Barth, considers it for quote unquote asserting ethnic ties. And along the same lines, Walker Connor calls it maintaining distinctive group boundaries. Since the late 90s, and we are familiar with the writings of nationalism starting from Benedict Anderson and his and people like Ernest Gellner and Eric Hobsbawm, they have tried to conceptualize such a relationship in a more theoretical manner. For instance, Gellner views that language acquires a certain degree of cultural homogeneity in the post-agrarian industrial societies. He considers the existence of a literate high culture and its possession of the liturgical language as one of the prominent characteristics of modern nationalism, because these liturgical languages, in his account, provide literacy and education to the masses, as well as accelerate processes of cultural and political homogeneity. However, he does not show how historically the structuring and practicing of one dominant language is invented and constructed. Again, for Hobsbawm, one of the most celebrated and leading historians of the 20th century, nationalism based on languages are invented nationalisms because, quote, national languages are always semi artificial constructs, unquote. He considers the criteria of language as a fuzzy and flexible in accounting for nationalism. As part of the modernization, he too links up the standardization and rationalization of a language or dialect with literacy, mass education, and printing. However, what characterizes a nation in his account is the historical past and a cultural elite possessing a written or national literary or vernacular administrative language. Though unlike Anderson and Gellner, Hobsbawm points out the inventiveness of, quote, philological nationalism. In his account, languages as semi-artificial constructs are languages of intercommunication among elites and rulers. It is their language of public spaces and intellectual discourses that is elevated to the status of national language. I don't have time, but there have been many writings, both in case of European and non-European context or Western and non-Western context. Uh, People like Rogers Brubaker and even Partha Chatterjee more recently actually addressing this issue of the relationship between language and nationalism. Third slide, next slide, please.
Okay, sure.
Since I have talked a little bit about the theoretical and conceptual understanding of linguistic nationalism until now, but we also need to see how the phenomena of linguistic nationalism takes various forms. And I will just briefly allude to that a bit. You have some points in the slide, but let me expand them further. An important aspect of linguistic nationalism is the idea, ideals, and forms of a nation, imagined and actualized through the normative category of language and its word historical provenance. For example, the 19th century Europe shows how one kind of language dominance in the social and political spheres of a state or a nation's citizens got replaced by another one. The earlier cases are that of Persian replaced by Urdu in 19th century and Urdu by Hindi language in the early 20th century. India, and more recently, the Serbo-Croatian conflict in the former Yugoslavia. The formation of nation states in 18th and 19th centuries Europe witnessed the nationalist uprisings around questions of language, identity, nationhood, and peoplehood. Histories of England, Germany, and France point out the struggle over languages and their identities. For example, in the 15th century, English came to be identified with Englishness and a common Anglo-Saxon descent of the nation. It was during this period that English in England was used for administrative and official spheres after French being displaced. By this time, the question of English national identity, quote, was mediated through speech and language as one of the complex political struggles. Graham Greene has argued that the rise of English in 15th century England was partially in response to the king's dependency on traditional aristocracy, which demanded in return more privileges, education, their own language, and literature to be written in English. Similarly, the nationalization of French in the 18th century during the post-revolutionary era has been well documented and written about. Not only the French language had to first create its identity vis-a-vis Latin, but also against several regional languages like Breton, Occitan, and Basque. David Bell, another celebrated author, a sociologist, argues that French unity was conceived through French language and thought, and French was idealized as the language of equality and universality, freedom and uniformity. These cases and numerous others from around the world show us that the discourse of linguistic nationalism is multivocal, heterogeneous, fragmented at times, divided, localized, racialized, ethnicized, and nationalized. This discourse often time posits the simultaneity of language and nation formation as coterminous process. I suggest that linguistic nationalism as a form of nationalism built on the social cultural heterogeneities and pluralities proceeds to collectivize them linguistically by restructuring the social and cultural identities, be they linguistic, cultural, racial, or regional. It is kind of hegemonic nationalism going beyond the dichotomy of elite and popular, cultural and political, and majority and minority nationalism, the categorization that we make about nationalism, which professes to carry within its contours multiple goals of equality, universality, and rationality. So, the phenomenon of linguistic nationalism, therefore, draws attention to the significance of language as part of a state ideology for unifying, however arbitrarily and at times anachronistically, the idea of unifying the nation state. And I think this important aspect needs to be kept in mind that through language, there is an idea of the unity of the nation of a certain kind. The language nationalism, therefore, interrogates a given symbiotic relationship between language and individual, not as somehow natural, but socially and politically constructed through three very specific modes of analysis, whereby the language is endowed with the capacity to create discourses, social and cultural practices, and identities in their mutual intersectionality. These modes of analysis reconstruct modes of representation and constitute them as natural, organic, moral, and political ones. The ideological basis of linguistic nationalism is primarily in terms of making of the national state or official languages, and this objective acquires a moral predicament and a question of political immediacy and primacy of national identity, whereby nation takes on the identity of a dominant linguistic community, which aims at nationalizing and homogenizing the social of a particular nation. The distinction between the national and non-national, I would say, itself is part of this ideology, whereby the regional is made national and is made national. And the national language is imagined to provide a nation form, a nation form which becomes an intermediary ground for nation formation and nation consolidation. This is a famous argument made by Balibar about the idea of nation form. The conceptual and empirical historical predicaments of linguistic nationalism inheres the process of instituting the project of the making of national state and official languages as some kind of a moral predicament. Thus, the ideology of linguistic nationalism is disseminated by legitimizing socially and politically a set of linguistic practices and programs, which are at times forcibly instituted to achieve the dual processes, seemingly contradictorily, of homogenization and heterogenization, as well as nationalization and provincialization of the linguistic identity of the state and nation. So these seemingly contradictory processes go simultaneously. Linguistic nationalism thrives and sustains itself by reinscribing and reinvigorating the hierarchies of various sorts, and it becomes an intrinsic part of the process of cultural and political collectivization as a historical construct. But we also need to remember the fact that the narrative of linguistic nationalism is also a suppressed narrative, a narrative of resistance and rebellion from the subordinate groups and communities, such as the Gaelic in Irish, in English, Basque in Spanish and French, Finnish in Sweden, Konkan in Marathi, or Awadhi in Devanagari Hindi languages, respectively. So what I'm suggesting is that it is not just the narrative about the dominant languages, but one also has to see the modes of resistance against these dominant languages. And that actually makes the narrative of linguistic nationalism much more complex and dense. In all of them, the former language, that is the dominant, the subordinate one, provides a counter hegemonic discourse about the latter's cultural and linguistic dominance by fanning out in the critical spheres of education, literature, occupation, print and social media, and so on. Their histories, that is, of the subordinate languages, or you can say minority languages, are elided under the dominant histories written. Next slide, please.
Mhm.
Okay. Since I'm talking about practices, I think it's important to see what are the sites and sites of linguistic nationalism. And that's to capture actually the resurgence of those resurgence of linguistic nationalism and how intense and vibrant it becomes historically from time to time. The court's administrative and pedagogical spheres, among others, become registers and official sites to recognize or legitimize a particular language historically. And these are interesting times globally, and much more in case of India, when we see the emphasis on one or two languages being taken as more important than others to mark the national identity of the country. Ideally, the languages of people should be the languages of law and judicial sites. It was on this plea that the Persian, the language of literati in 1837 in colonial India, was replaced by Urdu language in colonial North India. But later on, after almost 7 decades, around the time of 1900, Hindi became the court language instead of Urdu. The plea was that to obtain fair justice, it was important that legal petitions and judgments should be written and communicated in the languages of the contestants. Similarly, the social sites like temples, churches, mosques, monasteries, and the ecclesiastical discourses use languages of the religion, which may be different from the languages of the states and nations. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind how the relationship between language and religion in almost all languages of the world is a much contested one, or rather overlapping one. Furthermore, languages of rituals, whether of birth, death, marriage, defy the state imposed linguistic order of the day to conduct their ceremonial practices. However, languages of particular religions and scriptures are retained and associated with the claims of originality and purity of a particular language. I think this runs across many countries and nations throughout the world, this relationship between language and religion to grant the idea of sacredness and purity to some and not to others. These languages become centers of these become centers of production and consolidation of the idea of national identity or nationhood. For example, churches for Latin and English, mosques for Arabic, Mughal courts for Persian, Hindu temples for Sanskrit, Buddhist monasteries for Pali and Prakrit and Sikh gurdwaras for Gurumukhi are some such examples. Literary sites, including the rewriting of grammar books, dictionaries, school textbooks, are seen as essential sites to preserve the philological and historical genealogies of a particular language, making it more sacred than others. More often than not, the state at times appoints lexicographers, grammarians, folklorists, and philologists to standardize particular language forms along with the codification of grammars. New literary histories, cultural and material symbols and signs, new genres of translations and transliterations are used to revive the older languages and their communities of users. The history has shown us how the setting up of exclusive schools for imparting education, in particular Irish language, or writing up the school textbooks with strong ethical notes over the virtues and vices of learning a particular language, in this case, German language, including the Habsburg monarchy and Hindi Urdu conflict in modern India. Creation of dictionaries, grammar books, scripts, establishment of language societies, such as the Hungarian academies, Danish language union, and libraries to impart the instruction in Danish, Academia Francais to produce French vocabulary and grammars, and so forth are the examples which are not too distant in the past. So what I'm suggesting is that one needs to look at the phenomena of linguistic nationalism, both conceptually and historically, in order to understand the very, very conflictual relationship, but also a relationship which tends to give a certain kind of a idea of a uniformity and consolidation of the idea of nation and national identity. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. So Asha has described the house of nationalism, linguistic nationalism, very beautifully and in detail, both empirically, conceptually, methodologically, historically, from every angle and perspective. But my interest is the entire neighborhood in which this house is situated. So in all this, in any study of linguistic nationalism, the elephant in the room is the colonization lurking in the background. If you look at the history of any nation or want to study linguistic nationalism, one cannot but study the direct or indirect impact of colonization of the language of both these constructs and the relationship between the two. So as many people have said that English, I think the slide, so three go together: language, nationalism, and colonization. Some people have questioned that is this is not the case. So in case of Africa and Nigeria, Bisang said that if English should be abolished because it is foreign, then Nigeria itself would have to be dissolved because it was conceived as a colonial structure. So that is a quote to give you the connection between the two. The fate of indigenous languages and colonization. So following Mufwene, he has brilliantly categorized that three different types of colonization. So trader colonization, in which the rise of pigeons, they do not pose any or very little threat to indigenous languages. So that is the case of many nations in the world. So it may be English, French, Portuguese, whatever. Then the second type, settler colonization. Here the segregation and integration and eventual decimation of individual societies and languages. That is the case in Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, and in Caribbean countries, segregation, integration in Mexico, Guatemala, and the Andes. In the case of India, we are all too familiar with the, that is the exploitative colonization. So survival of indigenous languages compared to settler, so the languages are not, kind of touched with a heavy hand, so to say, because that's not the focus. And the colonial language is taught to a small local elite. And we are all too familiar with Macaulay's infamous minutes. So you can read that on your own. So, colonization, English or through other languages, French, they have these three different profiles or modes. And the history of linguistic nationalism cannot but take into account, these factors and these variables. Then the next concept that we get onto is the concept of linguistic imperialism. And again, just as Asha mentioned, that linguistic nationalism has another, that is counter-hegemonic resistance by the suppressed group. I will say that linguistic imperialism is the larger, kind of phenomenon or force that has to be resisted in practically any nation that wants to resort to make full use of its indigenous languages. So, this is, this is a long paper by Philipson, some two papers. So it is summarized as 7 points by, so I'll here the first form. So I read the 4 of them here. This is self-explanatory. I don't have to dwell on this too much. So, and these points pretty much echo. I think they, expand further the linguistic nationalism in one shade, that is the counter-hegemonic, uh, concept. So this is the nice summary of linguistic imperialism. Then the next point is, by the way, in case of linguistic imperialism, the Philippsons, we should also mention Skandinav Kangas, that who has called, that linguicism, that is the, that is in which the presence of English makes the growth of other languages, almost impossible or very detrimental to. She calls actually, comes out very heavily against English language teaching, British Council and all of that, but we need not go to that extreme. There are different, perspectives on that side of English and English, spread of English in other nations. So in the history of, or the discussion on globalization, it is assumed that globalization is only, one-way street. That is especially the cultural, globalization. That is, so linguistic, cultural, like English and other cultural practices, ideas, they kind of start from US, other Western countries, and reach out to the rest of the world. And then, nothing seems to come back, so to say. It is a one-way street. McCabe's quote is very important for us. That is, you can read it on your own. That is, it is not a one-way street. So cultures, and definitely we can talk, I know, since our focus is on India. So English has been, localized, indigenized. Professor Braj Kachru, he at UFI, he spent his entire life to studying, Indian English. English has also been made pluralized. So we talk about world Englishes now. There is a journal published by that name. So English, then the three circles of English. So we know that it is not a one-way street, be it language or a culture practice. So just as English has been, and then not only language, other cultural practices too. So even if from, economic or business context, so we project one set of ideas, practices, norms onto another culture in another nation. They get localized there, but then this being the two-way street, they eventually come back to us. So this McCabe's positions, I think, reminds us about that, two-way street between linguistic imperialism and globalization, that how there is no, kind of total, complete dominance, one-sided dominance of these forces and factors. Let me go to next one. The second point, the point that Asha has raised, that the connection between language and nationalism is under-theorized, under-studied. I think I want to dwell on that. And so I fully agree with that. And I will remind all the listeners to kind of undertake research. I would appeal, both of us would appeal to you to study this problematic. So language itself actually has been very superficially studied. So kind of how to say, it has been very reductionist way, so to say. And while I was studying the connection between language and culture, I came across this this new way of looking at language from evolutionary biologists, that they call that the development of language is as if adding a kind of second genetics to human beings. So language and culture, they are part and whole, that is for sure, but nothing or everything in culture, politics, economy, administration, nation, nationalism, everything in terms of human activity in any sphere from, anywhere, always happens in and through language. So in that sense, language is not part of culture. Language and culture, they become coterminous. So language needs to be studied much more deeply. So I think imagine that if language becomes a second genetics, and not understanding this second genetics, all our study of in political science, sociology, cultural studies, anthropology are going to be missing a whole lot of important details. So study of language use, disuse, maintenance, and shift, therefore, provide real-time data as well as historical patterns of construction and contestations of nationalism. So this is the age of big data, massive data. People are tracking everything. With AI, we don't know. I think the sky is the limit, so to say, for collecting data. So especially, I think I'm surprised that in India, the research on language maintenance and shift, I think in the last 2 decades seems to have been minimal, so to say. So I was researching on papers on these 2 topics, and the research seems to be pretty much where it was when I was a graduate student in linguistics in India. So this is kind of highly deplorable that in the age of data collection, sophistication of methodology and all that, we are not studying, because if we forget everything else and just actually document the maintenance and shift data of all languages, actually, if not all, maybe all 8 scheduled languages in India, will get such an interesting and rich, story of connection between language and nationalism that will, I can't wait to see that happen. So we'll stop here, I think both of us, and then we'll take up your questions now. Thank you very much for giving us a chance to share our ideas.
Thank you so much, Asha and Mishra. Mithilesh, while we're waiting for our audience to submit their questions, so please do submit them through Q&A. Maybe I can get us started a little bit. Actually, sort of connecting to, or tangentially connecting to the last slide, I was curious about what you could say about historical linguistics and how that impacts or doesn't impact the discourses about a national language in India. Sort of in the European context, the 19th century discourse about language is significantly different from 15th and 16th century selection of regional or core dialects as national languages, because so much of the discourse begins to be in terms of genealogies of a national language, and so much of it hinges on Sanskrit and India. So I was curious, sort of on the other side, does the development of historical linguistics during the 19th and 20th centuries have how does it intersect with discourses about nationalism and linguistics in India?
Asha, I want to go first.
I think a great question, Tim. The idea of historical linguistics as a sort of scientific aspect of linguistics was much used by the colonial linguists. For example, people like William Jones and others who, as part of the Orientalist discourse, studying Indian languages, Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, and other, did talk about the way in which Indian languages need to be sort of made sense of, because they themselves were baffled to see the diversity and the heterogeneity of languages within the country. And as Bani Kaur in his classical essay, Language of Command and Command of Language, argued that for the colonial officials, it became almost impossible to legitimize their rule or to govern the subjects properly without understanding their languages. So I think you have an Indologist discourse prior to the colonial rule, and there I agree with Dr. Mishra that colonization did make a huge impact in sort of trying to characterize and territorialize languages. Languages had very fuzzy boundaries earlier, but with the idea of state, in this sense, the colonial state, it was also important for them to demarcate and delineate the territorial identity of different provinces and states. So to what extent historical linguistics actually impacted the understanding of Indian languages? I think this then, after the colonial rule was over, and many people have alerted to it, that we have continued to use certain notions of a language still with us. And therefore, I think the call that Dr. Mishra made at the end to revisit those conceptual categories, in this case, historical linguistics as a branch of studying languages, is much needed. Whether it is in terms of understanding Sanskrit or Persian or other classical languages like Tamil and Malayalam, which have increasingly become which have raised extremely important political questions in contemporary India, we also need to look at languages in a more critical manner and not simply as means and devices of communication. That was the way in which colonial state used Indian languages. But I think in post-colonial India, the kind of writings that are emerging are looking at the language discourses or debates, not just about English and Indian languages, but also how languages of a certain kind with certain normative conceptual categorization have evolved. So certain languages are seen as more worthy of importance that needs to be accorded to them by the nation, or political regimes from time to time take up some languages or give significance to one or two languages more than the other. So I think historical linguistics come in handy so far as in understanding the understanding the languages as more rational and sort of in a disciplinary sense that Dr. Mishra maybe can reflect more on is, but also in terms of looking at the cultural evolution of particular languages and not something just given as natural, but also socially, politically, culturally, ideologically constructed. So I think it plays both the parts. But I think Dr.
Yeah,
Mishra
and
can
I would
say
like
more
to add
on
that. Yeah, I would like to add, Tim, that William Jones' quote unquote discovery of Sanskrit actually seemed to be so problematic for the British Empire because before that, the idea was that we have nothing in common with you guys. But once it was found that, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, they are like the first cousins, then I think the legitimacy of the empire, I think, proved to be on, in a very kind of shifty ground. I mean, and so that is one thing. And then historical linguistics in India, I think in the 19th, 20th century, mostly I think people have been concerned with the, as far I know, that is the development of languages. That is, the whole, like from Sanskrit to Prakrit to Pali to Apabhransha to modern Indo-Aryan languages. This itself is such a long chain of, languages to be studied. I don't think that our knowledge of the medieval part of, like, especially the later ancient, like the Prakrit and Pali, I think that needs to be studied much more in terms of socio-economic, political, constructs of nationalism. Especially Pali, I'm very interested in, because Buddha, he knew Sanskrit very well, but he gave all his sermons for 45 long years in Pali. And Pali was the language of masses. So he was clearly, openly confronting the linguistic hegemony of Brahmanical Sanskritism in India. And the beauty is that he, kind of got by. I think, yes, people opposed him, they discussed him, but he was allowed to do that. And so that is a very, fascinating process, that how for 45 long years, Buddha attained Nirvana at 35 and he passed away at 80. For 45 long years, he kept giving discourses in Pali in the face of Brahmanical orthodoxy and Brahmanical, the use of Sanskrit. And as I said that, so he knew what he was doing. So it's a very complex topic, but we need to study that part of the challenge. So the development and changes, like from Vedic Sanskrit to, classical Sanskrit to Prakrit, then Prakrit also has several branches, then Pali. So people have been concerned mostly on the linguistic development per se, and not its far-reaching, implications outside linguistics proper.
Can I just add one more aspect to it, which is that the whole idea of or the aspect of historical linguistics that became dominant during the colonial rule was also to look at some languages in a very standardized form, and to argue, people like Macaulay and William Jones and others, that the languages which have gone through certain kind of historical evolutionary process actually determines their survivability. And therefore, it is so this was a kind of a scale to measure the significance or durability of Indian languages, and the classification of Indian languages, which were far too numerous for the colonial state to comprehend and make policy on, number one. Number two, this kind of a standardization and homogenization of linguistic landscape using certain variables of measurement also crept into the whole process of classification and categorization, which actually took a very, very scientific rationality kind of an argument, a very, very pragmatic scientific rational argument, which began to be used by the processes of enumeration. Enumeration, as the languages were counted, classified, categorized, some were called vulgar, some were called not sophisticated enough, some were called incapable in Macaulay's sense of conducting or writing the sophisticated literature. But that discourse began to actually shape the state project of enumeration through gazetteers, through census reports. And once the categorization of this kind, with a very, very normative and biased understanding of languages happens, it actually begins to affect the linguistic repertoire of the place or of the country, you can say. And we are stuck with those classificatory logic till now, when we look at languages through very, very narrow sort of lens and categorize them. For example, any language is spoken in India which has less than 10,000 speakers doesn't even enter the registers of census. It's not counted, right? So it's counted as a speech variety or something else, but not as a language. So numbers played a very, very important role in determining which language is worthy of state attention.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to one of the questions from one of our audience members. Could you go more in depth into the intersection of language imperialism and Nigerian nationalism, shown in one of the quotes in the slides you shared? How exactly is English tied to the national identity of Nigeria? And would you say that this was in effect the result of what you guys called the two-way street property of globalization. I don't know who wants to
That
take
is
it up.
for you. That is for Dr. Mishra.
Yeah. So actually, this follows not only in Nigeria. I think many people have argued that nation itself is actually not an indigenous, construct or concept in several modern nations, so to say. So the concept of nation itself is, an imposed category. I was it is, I think, kind of casually said that the only country that didn't have any nationalism is England. Okay, so they were busy exporting or imagining, reinventing, creating, nationalism all over the world. But this is the other country around them, like Welsh, Irish. I mean, they all had the nationalistic aspirations and constructs. But as I said, this is just one, kind of view of that. So the English in Nigeria, I think it plays all the classical role that is that of English elsewhere, in the world, especially in entire Africa, maybe South Asia also. That is, this is the language that elides or kind of what linguicism that makes the growth, continuation, development of other, indigenous languages hard, difficult, or almost impossible. But I call it the catch-22, English as a catch-22 language. Nations cannot do without it, you cannot do with it. So you need it. At the same time, you also have, this love-hate relationship. And again, this is true for the entire, all the world, so to say, about English. So for modernization, for development of indigenous languages, for incorporation of what they call or using language for progressive functions, not just expressive functions. That is not just talking to friends and family and writing a poem or expressing one's feelings and emotions. So language has two functions, expressive functions versus progressive functions. So the moment we go into progressive functions of any language, I think there are very, outside Europe, I will say, that is, every other nation is practically helpless, and has to borrow terms from English in terms, for science, technology, governance, finance, modern trade, technology, electronics, you name it. And then you start, kind of tweaking it. So you want to make it, indigenization, or indigenization. So that is, you make, you create your own rules for borrowing the lexicons from English. So in that sense, and again, the referential range of the borrowed words, they get tweaked in every country, every culture, locally. So it's a very fascinating process. In general, this has happened in India, that is, Sanskrit words retained in all Indo-Aryan languages. They do not have the same shade of meaning. So English words borrowed in practically, all modern nations, now even, modern nations and languages thereof. They, other than if it is for object, the moment you get outside object, I think they create their own, range, semantic range, tweak it, create it new. So, as I said, so nation in that sense is both nation and the impact of English, that is linguistic imperialism, has to be, for any country to emerge and attain the kind of, aspire to become a nation, sustain itself as a nation, keep growing as a nation, they have to be kind of, it's a balancing act. You want to have, your own national history, linguistic varieties preserved, kind of made stronger. At the same time, you are dealing with the outside forces, and you are trying to strike a balance. In that sense, I said that it's a two-way street.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're a little bit past our 1 o'clock mark. So thank you very much for the audience. Thank you so much for the speakers. As Steve mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of 3 talks. The second one will be on March 22nd and the third on March 29th, all at noon Central Time. Thank you so much for Asha, Sarangi, and Mithilesh. Mishra, as Steve again mentioned, we will have a video of this talk that you can consult on the CGS website. And good luck with the rest of your day. We will see you after spring break on March 22nd. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, Asha. Good night.
Good night.
Oh, by the way, happy, this is International Women's Day today. So
that's right.
Greetings.
Yes.
So much happening today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.